Alright folks, welcome to our Makeup Week 3 online lecture due to the Labor Day public holiday. So, as I said, for those who are in attendance in Week 2, this is going to go for about 20 to 25 minutes, hopefully closer to 20. And effectively it's an introduction, as the screen says, an introduction to risk in environmental impact assessment. So last week we gave a bit of a brief introduction to what EIA is as a concept. So we're kind of taking a step back, maybe a step sideways, you could say, to connect EIA to this idea of risk. So effectively, risk is about some sort of harm. So the idea of environmental harm and avoiding harm to the environment is effectively the justification for EIA, but the concept of risk itself is complex, multidimensional, it's political. It has resulted in particular kinds of tools like risk assessments. So we're going to talk a little bit about how risk relates to environmental impact assessment, concluding with an example of how risk is being presented in discussions about how we might revise EIA. And by revise I mean effectively how risk is being used in political discussions about ways to reduce red tape, or if you like, green tape, which is frankly a horrible term. But this idea of green tape reduction is pretty prominent at the moment, as you have probably heard, and risk is being deployed as a term in that debate, so particularly to do with EIA, so we're going to talk a bit about that at the end. So as I've said, connecting EIA to risk and how risk and certainty, or risk and uncertainty, are importantly related topics. But to start with the big picture, as I said, the idea that there is a risk to the environment from development activities is really the justification for EIA and how EIA came about as a legislative instrument. So that we need to protect the environment, we need to protect human health and well-being from inappropriate development that doesn't pay due consideration to environmental impacts. And it's not just the idea that there are inevitable impacts. I mean, risk has resonance in this argument because it's this idea of there being a risk of negative impacts. So what type of risks are we exposing ourselves to as a result of pursuing certain development activities? And that might be risks, connecting it a little bit to the sustainable development discussion from last week. It might be risks to the current environment, direct, immediate, acute risks as a result of a specific activity. There might be future risks of legacy impacts that the things we do now are going to have an impact on in the future. And the same might apply to communities. It might be about current immediate risk to communities, or it might be about what issues, what problems we might be setting ourselves up for in terms of risks to future communities, future generations. So and as I said, so I'm going to start by talking about certainty, but just as important, and I guess when I'm talking about certainty, I'm also framing this idea of how we think about certainty, and the flip side being uncertainty, and how important it is to keep that idea in mind of how certain can we be about our ability to assess risk and to identify the potential risks of action. Because if we frame our ability to know what risks we're likely to encounter as being absolute, or we're pretty certain, we're pretty confident in our ability to identify risk and to understand what the likely risks of a project are, then maybe we set ourselves up for a bit of a fall there. Maybe there's a bit of hubris in that type of attitude, but we'll keep that in mind because we get back to that at the end. But as I said, it's not just that we think, in general terms about risk underpinning environmental impact or concern about what impacts might be. It really has become terminology and a concept that is embedded in environmental policy. To the point that really we often think about this idea of suffering harm. Risk is really effectively defined as the possibility of suffering harm, and that's a really important perspective, because if there is harm, then we need to understand what how serious that harm is likely to be, and then we get into debates about what is an acceptable level of harm, because we do effectively through EIA we accept a certain level of harm. We say that is we try to avoid the harm, reduce it, but inevitably there is, with big development projects, some level of harm. So what do we accept? Knowing that we can't, generally speaking, eliminate all of it. So it's that idea embedded in risk of what is the hazard, and then if that hazard is significant enough that we risk harm being done, then we need to assess what the likelihood of that harm is, and that's effectively a risk assessment. How do we monitor, how do we understand, how do we assess the likelihood of harm being done? So in effect then, a risk assessment is the likelihood of an impact occurring. So what is the chance that this paper mill that we've built next to a waterway is going to result in pollutants from the paper dyeing process leaching into the waterway? We can effectively assess, we can come up with some type of measurement tool that might help us understand the likelihood of that impact occurring. And then if that was to occur, what is the severity of that impact going to be? So when we unpack it this way, it helps to see that, well, look, some impacts are going to be substantially more severe than others. I remember when the Large Hadron Collider opened, they came out with some statistic about there being a 0.00, lots of zeros, 1, 2 chance of the world imploding as a result of switching on the Large Hadron Collider. So a pretty severe impact, you could say, but a relatively low likelihood. And that is an interesting example of a risk assessment where you've got large n's, low, very low likelihood, very high severity. And that's why we might entertain projects that have high severity. It's because they've been assessed as a low likelihood of that impact occurring. What often doesn't get represented, although this is starting to change a bit, and we'll talk more about this as the semester goes on, that we're starting to see a greater sensitivity to time in our assessment processes, but duration has traditionally not been sufficiently factored in to risk assessment. So we often think about immediate risk, what's going to happen in the short term, and that could be defined as what's going to happen in the construction phase of a project, what's going to happen in the life of a project or a piece of infrastructure, we are now starting to get more conscious of what happens after, what happens long term, what happens multiple generations into the future. Who will have to deal with this cleanup? Who will have to deal with the transition of this thing into a new form? And what are the implications of that? Now, one simple and very commonly widespread, common and widespread application of risk assessment is a very basic risk assessment matrix where you take this idea of likelihood and severity, or in this case probability and severity, the same thing, and you represent it with these very basic metrics. So using a 1 to 5 scale, you might have the probability of the impact occurring along this row here, and then you unpack what some of the elements of severity might be. So potential regulatory and legal implications, that is an element of how severe a project might be. So like in anything that that would be approved in an EIA context, there is going to be legal or regulatory implications if something didn't go to plan, because it is a formal planning and statutory process. If things went bad, what would be the cost of remediation? So another point of severity. Effect on public image, now that's an interesting one. But these four, a general point about severity of impact, so of the actual thing, like if it's about water contamination, if it's about air pollution, what is the likely direct impact severity of that effect? So you would give that a rating. And then you add these up. So these are all elements of severity in the blue, as done here. And that would give you a severity times probability rating. So you 4 times 10, 40. Now what you would do you do the same thing for noise and for whatever else it might be. And what this does, it's crude, evidently. What this does is gives you a basic rating of what the biggest hazard is going to be, and what that allows you to do then is prioritize. So you know that you need to put a substantial amount of resources into managing hazardous waste, which makes sense. You need to put much less effort into noise. So that's the type of thing that this table will get used for, and then it gets represented in ways like this. So things that come out as, now you can imagine this is your same type of 1 to 5 scale. If likelihood is almost certain, then you know that's 5. If it's rare, that's 1. And so you basically can plug in your metrics from the previous table into something like this, and it gives you, it's a way of communicating a low, medium, high risk, very high, sorry, as well, category. Now, what inevitably gets asked when you look at these types of things is, yes, but how do you know when something is a 3 and when something is a 1 or when something is a 5? That's, in a sense, the scariest part of risk assessment, is that there might be some standardized measures for determining, for example, how severe an impact might be. But what these types of processes generally rely on are the knowledge and experience of the people involved. So in a way, if you have some knowledge of EIA and some knowledge of the issue and risk at hand, then there's not much that separates you from someone who's doing this type of work on a professional basis. So that can be a little bit confronting to know that that these types of processes are being done in this sort of way, and that there isn't often a clear way of prioritizing that doesn't involve some type of judgment. And so if you were to do this yourself, you would be required to use your own judgment to a substantial extent to determine priorities. Okay, so some of the issues, and this is sort of getting into the applied political aspects of it, the policy dimensions, is whose risks do we take assessment do we take notice of? Now, what I've presented so far is a pretty sort of professionally framed, standardized approach to assessing risk, but these types of processes, when presented as being overly or excessively instrumental, can close out other ways of knowing, sensing, understanding risk. They can deprioritize the role of the public in determining what risk is. And there is often a narrative amongst expert risk assessors, and you can imagine from the perspective of, if you consider yourself to be a professional risk assessment consultant, and you're probably going to be pretty protective of your turf, and you may be of the view that the public or communities that might be affected by certain projects are not sufficiently informed in the way that you are to evaluate the likelihood of risk. But there are a host of citizen science community monitoring type initiatives that have proved very effective in assessing risk, and these can be as basic as somebody who's lived in a region for a long period of time. And these are sort of classic examples with things like timber mills or power plants in small valley communities where when you can't see from one side of the valley to the other, then people know there is a certain that the air quality has gotten to a particularly bad point. The same thing with water, like not being able to see the bottom of a particular stream when you usually can might be an indicator that something's wrong. Now, these aren't easily quantifiable metrics, but they do give us some sense that there might be issues with some environmental factor. So there are ways that this type of community knowledge should be and can be integrated into risk assessment, but we do have an over-reliance on expert-driven processes, and this can be to our detriment. So, so just to take a very quick step back, so we often frame the average person or ecosystem as the locus, or the factor on which risk is determined. So we have a very broad brush approach to defining people and environment in risk often. And we can sometimes be a little bit blasé about what it actually means to say we accept a certain level of risk. So there is something to be said about this idea that if we continually accept levels of risk to the environment and to communities as a result of various development projects, have we and do we incrementally get more accepting of levels of risk? Do we legitimize the idea that risk that could lead to pollution, could lead to environmental degradation is legitimate? And do we gradually over time increase our exposure to risk because certain things don't happen? Classic one would be bushfire. This idea that the longer we go between bushfire events, we see a loss of community knowledge, of the expectation that this can happen again. and people can become complacent about those types of things. The same type of attitude can be present in our exposure to risk. So in trying to reduce risk, we are essentially trying to reduce the uncertainty around the potential for environmental harm. So we're trying to, as I said earlier, this idea of certainty and uncertainty, we're trying to reduce the amount of uncertainty. So if we know what the risks are, in theory, they're less likely to eventuate because we might be able to mitigate them. And that is a pretty pivotal part to the way that we engage with risk at the moment. We do have a tendency to say, well, look, we can mitigate these issues, we can deal with them. We don't need to not do this development because we have the technology, we have the expertise to reduce our exposure to risk. And in that sense, we get to this really critical point about risk, is that it's not a simple categorization, it's not a simple definition, that what constitutes risk it's up for debate with any project. So whoever controls the definition of risk controls the rational solution to the problem at hand. So in a sense of understanding how power dynamics might work in environmental impact assessment, if you are able to define what constitutes risk for a given development, then you're also able to suggest, well, either we have the solution to deal with that risk, or that risk is not as substantial as has been made out. Okay? So to contextualize that, I've got a little passage from the 2015 House of Reps Standing Committee report on the environment, which was the inquiry into streamlining environmental regulation, green tape and one-stop shops, which we will touch on again because it was about understanding how we can streamline environmental impact assessment processes. Now, I'll read this to you. So the Queensland Ports Association made a submission to this standing committee, and this is one of their points. So the Queensland Ports Association stated that assessment and approval processes could be streamlined through the proper adoption of evidence-based assessment using rigorous science and risk assessment methods. QPA submitted that too often project assessments are delayed due to opinions of regulators, scientists or interest groups that are not supported by scientific evidence or previous actual examples. There needs to be greater emphasis and reliance placed on sound risk-based assessment methodologies. The first step is the development of risk-based assessment terms of reference targeted at issues of importance or environmental risks. So the Queensland Ports Association are obviously a pro-development group. They are advocating for further development and ongoing development of Queensland ports for a whole range of different purposes, be they enabling recreational opportunities, enabling resource development. So it's in their interests to get projects approved as quickly as possible. Okay? So, given that, why are Queensland ports using terms like evidence-based, that we need a rigorous science and risk assessment process for environmental approvals, that we need rigorous assessment methodologies, that we need some type of risk-based assessment terms of reference on which we base the need for environmental approvals? Now, I would argue that these types of terms, these types of phrases, this type of broad argument could be found in any type of conservation agency or environmental agency submission that was arguing for more rigorous, more thorough environmental impact assessment, right? But what we see here is we see this language and these concepts being deployed by an organisation that actually wants less oversight on environmental approvals. Okay, so just going back again, they want the proper adoption of evidence-based assessment. They are skeptical about delays due to opinions of regulators and scientists or interest groups, maybe we could read community as part of that are not supported by scientific evidence or previous actual examples. There's a lot going on here, and there's a lot of terms and phrases that you could say in a different context, used by a different agency, could be arguing the case for better, more rigorous environmental assessment. So my questions to you are, what on earth is going on here? Why are QPA taking this approach? And I want you to think about that in the context of how they're seeking to control the definition of risk and how we think about things like certainty and how we think about things like uncertainty and on what basis we should progress projects when we're uncertain about their impact. So these are the things I want you to reflect on and that we'll discuss at the start of our week 4 lecture. How are Queensland ports using the concept of risk to further their development agenda through this submission? What might this case tell us about the importance of including uncertainty as a factor in decision making? How can we defend against the use of science and science metrics or terms for the types of ends that we see here? So what are Queensland ports trying to do? That's effectively what I want you to reflect on, and I want to talk about at the start of week 4, because it is about the effectiveness of EIA, both now and into the future, will be defined by these types of debates and about who controls definitions, about how we frame what constitutes evidence, what constitutes reliable information, what constitutes credible sources. All these things are critically important. So have a bit of a think about that. And as I said, we will kick off week 4 with that discussion. So enjoy thinking through these issues. There are no easy answers to these questions, but it is an opportunity for us to think about how EIA works in practice and how it's being chipped away at continually, and it's constantly in need of defence and it's constantly in need of advocacy. So we will kick off week 4 with that chat. If you have any questions about Assessment Task 1, and letting you know that for those who weren't in class, info on Assessment Task 1 is up on Blackboard. I will also post, or will have also posted by the time this goes up, an article in Interesting Stuff, on the Interesting Stuff tab, about Indigenous peoples and EIA processes. That was in the media recently, and maybe one or two other things. But as I said earlier on, keep an eye on that tab as the weeks progress. All right, see you very soon.